She never set out to prove anyone wrong. She just wanted to feed her family. But sometimes, when you follow the old ways in a world obsessed with the new, people don't just disagree with you. They pity you. They mock you. They stand at the edge of your field with their arms crossed and their heads shaking, already convinced you have failed before a single seed has even broken through the soil. And that is exactly where our story begins. Not in a laboratory, not in a university lecture hall, but in 5 acres of dusty Oklahoma soil, where a 53-year-old widow named Margaret Holloway planted corn the wrong way, in circles, and 4 months later, the same people who laughed at her were begging to study what she had done. Margaret didn't look like a revolutionary. She looked like your grandmother. If your grandmother had spent 40 years waking up before dawn to pull weeds and mend fences. Her hands were mapped with cracks and calluses. Her back had a permanent curve from decades of bending over rows of beans and tomatoes, and her eyes, pale blue and faded by the Oklahoma sun, held the kind of quiet stubbornness that comes from outlasting every storm the plains have ever thrown at a person. She had buried her husband, raised 3 children alone, and kept a farm running through droughts, floods, and a market that seemed determined to pay farmers less every single year. By the time she turned 50, she had nothing left to prove to anyone, or so she thought. The trouble started with a memory. One evening in late February, as the last purple light bled across her kitchen table, Margaret found herself thinking about her grandmother. Not the grandmother who had taught her to can peaches or sew quilts, the other one, the Creek grandmother who had died when Margaret was only 7, but who had left behind images that had burned themselves into her mind like photographs she couldn't forget. She remembered sitting on the porch swing, swinging her legs, watching her grandmother walk through the garden. But it wasn't a garden like the ones Margaret had kept all her life. There were no straight lines, no neat military rows of corn standing at attention. Instead, her grandmother's corn grew in circles, small mounds of dark earth, each one cradling a cluster of seeds, arranged in spiraling patterns that seemed to move if you looked at them long enough. Margaret had asked why. Her grandmother had smiled and said something in a language Margaret was too young to understand. Then she pressed a seed into Margaret's palm and closed her fingers over it. That was the last time they ever spoke about it. 46 years later, sitting alone in a farmhouse that felt emptier with every passing season, Margaret closed her own fingers around that same memory. She had been farming the modern way her entire adult life. Straight rows. Chemical fertilizers, pesticides that made her throat burn when the wind shifted, genetically modified seeds that promised higher yields but somehow drained more money from her bank account every year. She was tired. Not just physically tired, though her body ached in ways that ibuprofen couldn't touch. She was tired of fighting a system that seemed designed to break her. Tired of watching her neighbors mortgage their land to buy the newest equipment, only to lose it all to the bank 5 years later. Tired of standing in the co-op listening to men half her age explain to her, slowly and loudly, how farming actually worked, as if she hadn't been doing it since before they were born. So she made a decision that would have seemed small to anyone else, but to her it felt like stepping off a cliff. She decided to plant her corn the way her grandmother had planted it, in circles, on mounds, without fertilizer, without pesticides, without the hybrid seeds the Agricultural Extension Office kept pushing on her. She would plant the old seeds she had found in a mason jar at the back of her pantry, seeds that had been sitting there for so long she wasn't sure they would even germinate. She would plant them with beans and squash, the way her grandmother had done, letting the 3 crops grow together in a tangle that every modern farming manual would call a disaster. She would do it on 5 acres of her worst land, the rocky, sloped field that the county soil survey had labeled marginal at best, and she would do it without telling anyone what she was really doing. The first person to find out was her son, David, who came by the farm on the first Saturday of March to help her prepare for the season. David was a practical man who worked in insurance in Tulsa. He found Margaret in the barn, sorting seeds by hand, her fingers moving through the dried kernels with a tenderness that made him pause in the doorway. He asked what she was doing. She told him she was getting ready to plant. He nodded, expecting the usual routine, and offered to help her calibrate the planter. She told him she wouldn't be using the planter. She told him she was going to plant by hand. Then she told him about the circles. David didn't yell. He never yelled at his mother. But she could see the concern flood his face like a storm rolling across the prairie. He talked about yield per acre. He talked about efficiency. He talked about how the bank didn't care about traditions, they cared about numbers. When he finally ran out of arguments, she looked at him and said, "Son, I've been farming this land for 30 years your way. I've never once made a profit. This year, I'm going to try my grandmother's way. If I lose 5 acres, I lose 5 acres. But what if I don't lose?" David had no answer for that. He hugged her before he left, and she could feel the worry trembling in his shoulders. The mocking started the moment the neighbors noticed. In rural Oklahoma, privacy is a myth. Your business is everyone's business, and your fields are visible from every county road. By the second week of March, when Margaret began turning over the soil in the south field with nothing but a broadfork and a hoe, the phones began to ring. Old farmers called other old farmers. Wives called wives. And by the time the first mounds were shaped, there was a steady stream of vehicles slowing down at the edge of Margaret's property, drivers craning their necks to stare at the woman who was apparently trying to farm like it was 1890. Harold Crenshaw was the first to actually say something. He had the farm to the east, 600 acres of perfectly managed corn and soybeans, every row laser straight, every weed chemically annihilated. He pulled his side-by-side up to the fence line on a Tuesday morning, the engine idling, and watched Margaret work for a solid 10 minutes before he spoke. "Margaret," he called out, his voice carrying across the 30 yards of grass between them. "You know they got machines for that now, right?" She didn't look up. She kept shaping her mound, patting the soil with the back of her hoe. "I know, Harold," she said. "I just prefer to feel what I'm doing." Harold laughed, a short, sharp sound that wasn't really a laugh at all. "Well," he said, "I guess when you're ready to farm like a professional, you let me know. I'll send my crew over to fix that mess for you." He drove off before she could answer, kicking up dust that drifted across her field like a gray veil. By the end of March, the mounds were ready. 57 of them, arranged in a pattern that looked chaotic to the untrained eye, but that Margaret could see was a spiral, a slow unwinding of circles that followed the contour of the land. Each mound was about 3 feet across, raised a foot above the surrounding soil, packed with compost she had made herself from kitchen scraps and barn manure. She had worked every single one by hand, and her hands showed it. Her palms were blistered, then calloused, then blistered again. Her shoulders ached so badly at night that she slept sitting up in her grandmother's rocking chair, the only position that didn't make her want to scream. But every morning she went back out. Every morning she shaped another mound, or amended another circle, or simply stood in the field and felt the sun on her face and remembered her grandmother's voice. The planting itself took place over 3 days in early April, during a window of warm weather that the old-timers said felt right. Margaret didn't consult a soil thermometer or a planting calendar app. She consulted her memory. She remembered the feel of her grandmother's hands guiding her own, showing her how deep to push the corn kernels, how many to plant in each mound. She planted 4 corn seeds in the center of each mound, pushing them down into the dark soil until her knuckles disappeared. Then, around the edges of the mound, she planted pole beans, the kind that would climb the corn stalks as they grew, feeding the soil with nitrogen. And finally, between the mounds, she planted squash and pumpkin seeds, the broad leaves already visible in her mind, spreading across the ground to shade out weeds and keep the soil moist. It was a system older than Oklahoma itself, a system that had fed people for thousands of years before anyone had ever heard of a tractor or a combine or a genetically modified organism. When she finished the last mound on the evening of the third day, she stood at the edge of the field and looked at what she had created. 57 circles of dark earth, spiraling across 5 acres of marginal land, holding seeds that might or might not grow, surrounded by a county full of people who thought she had lost her mind. The sun was setting behind her, painting the sky in colors so vivid they looked like they belonged on a church window, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt something she had forgotten existed. She felt hope, not the desperate, clinging hope of someone trying to survive another season, but the quiet, steady hope of someone who has finally, after decades of running, stopped to listen to what the land has been trying to tell her all along. The first month was the hardest. Not because anything went wrong, but because nothing seemed to go right. The corn germinated slowly, much more slowly than the hybrid varieties her neighbors were planting with their precision equipment. For 2 weeks, Margaret walked her field every morning and every evening, searching for the first green shoots, finding nothing but bare soil. Harold Crenshaw drove by every few days, his side-by-side slowing to a crawl as he passed her field. She never looked up, but she could feel his eyes on her, could imagine the smirk on his face as he catalogued her failure for the coffee shop gossip circuit. Other neighbors stopped by too, some out of genuine concern, others out of morbid curiosity. They offered to help her replant. They offered to sell her proper seed. One man from the grain elevator offered to plow the whole field under for free just to save her the embarrassment. She thanked them all and kept walking her circles. Then, in the 3rd week of April, the first green spears pushed through the soil, not all at once like the uniform emergence you see in commercial fields, but one here, one there, a scattered constellation of pale green that seemed to appear overnight. Margaret knelt beside the first shoot she found, a fragile, trembling thing no thicker than a thread, and she wept. She didn't know why. She had seen corn emerge thousands of times in her life. But this was different. This was her grandmother's seed, pushing through soil she had prepared with her own hands, in a pattern she had carried in her memory for 46 years. She stayed on her knees for an hour, her fingers in the dirt, whispering words she didn't understand in a language she had never learned, feeling something ancient and wordless moving through her like a current. By mid-May, the circles were visible from the road, not as bare mounds anymore, but as clusters of green life, each one a small universe of corn and beans and squash, growing together in a tangle that made no sense to the agricultural eye. The corn was shorter than the hybrid varieties in the surrounding fields, sturdier, with broader leaves and thicker stalks. The beans had wrapped themselves around the corn almost immediately, their tendrils clinging with a desperation that seemed almost affectionate, and the squash was spreading, not in orderly rows, but in a wild, exuberant carpet of broad leaves that covered the ground between the mounds and turned the entire field into a mosaic of green textures. From the road, it looked like a mess. From the ground, it looked like a living system. The drought hit in June. Not the slow, creeping drought that builds over months, but a sudden, brutal blast of heat that turned the Oklahoma sky into a white furnace and sucked the moisture from the soil with terrifying speed. Within 2 weeks, the county was under severe drought conditions. The corn in the commercial fields began to show stress almost immediately. Leaves curled, stalks yellowed. Farmers who had invested in irrigation systems ran their pumps around the clock, watching their electric bills climb into the thousands while their crops still struggled. The ones without irrigation, which was most of them, could only watch and pray. Margaret didn't have irrigation. She couldn't afford it. But she noticed something strange in her field. The circles weren't suffering, or rather they were suffering, but they were suffering differently. The squash leaves, broad and thick, had created a living mulch that shaded the soil and kept it from drying out as quickly as the bare ground in the surrounding fields. The beans, with their deep taproots, were pulling moisture from layers of soil that the shallow-rooted corn couldn't reach, and the corn itself, planted in mounds rather than flat rows, seemed to be accessing water from the depressions between the circles. where runoff collected and sank into the soil. The system was working together, each plant supporting the others, creating a microclimate that was more resilient than any single crop could have been alone. She still had to water. Every evening she carried buckets from the well, walking her spiral pattern, pouring water directly into the mounds by hand. It took 3 hours every night. Her back screamed, her arms shook, but she didn't miss a single evening. And every morning she walked the field and saw her plants still standing, still green, still growing while the world around them turned brown and brittle. Harold Crenshaw's field was one of the first to show real damage. By late June his corn was waist-high and yellowing, the leaves hanging limp like flags of surrender. He had stopped driving by Margaret's place. She noticed his absence more than she had noticed his presence. The other neighbors still came, but their tone had changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by something more complicated. Confusion, curiosity, a dawning suspicion that maybe, just maybe, the old widow wasn't as crazy as they had thought. The squash bloomed in July, great golden flowers, wide as a dinner plate, opening in the morning and closing in the afternoon heat. The bees came in clouds, drawn by the pollen and the nectar, filling the air with a sound like distant machinery. Margaret had never seen so many bees. Her neighbors' fields, with their monocultures and their chemical regimens, had always seemed sterile by comparison, the silence between the rows broken only by the wind. But her field was alive. Insects she couldn't name moved through the squash leaves. Birds she had never seen before perched on the corn stalks, picking caterpillars from the tassels. The system was creating its own ecosystem, attracting the predators and pollinators that industrial farming had driven away, building a web of life that sustained itself without chemicals or human intervention. And the corn was growing, not the towering, thin-stalked corn that her neighbors grew, the kind that reached 10 feet high and produced massive ears but required constant chemical support. Her corn was shorter, 7 feet maybe, but the stalks were thick as a man's wrist, the leaves dark green and broad, the root systems visible at the base of each mound like gnarled fingers gripping the earth. The ears were forming too, fat and full, wrapped in husks that seemed almost too small to contain them. She peeled back the silk on one ear in late July just to see, and found kernels in colors she had forgotten existed. Not the uniform yellow of commercial corn, but a rainbow of gold and red and purple and blue, each ear a unique pattern, like a fingerprint. David came to visit in early August, bringing his wife and children for the weekend. He had been calling every week, his voice carefully neutral, asking about the field, asking about her health, asking if she needed money. She had told him the field was fine. She had told him she was fine, but he hadn't believed her until he saw it with his own eyes. They drove up on a Friday evening, the sun hanging low and heavy in the western sky, and David stopped his car at the edge of the south field and simply stared. His children pressed their faces against the windows, asking questions he couldn't answer. His wife felt something catch in her throat at the sight of those 57 circles, green and thriving in a landscape that had turned the color of dust. David walked the field with his mother that evening, and she showed him things he had never learned in agricultural school. She showed him how the beans had fixed nitrogen in the soil, the root nodules visible when she gently pulled a plant from the edge of a mound. She showed him how the squash leaves had suppressed the weeds without a single drop of herbicide. She showed him the moisture in the soil beneath the squash canopy, the earth dark and crumbly where the surrounding fields had cracked into hard plates. She showed him the insects, the birds, the life that had returned to a piece of land that had been farmed to exhaustion for generations. And she showed him the corn, the ears heavy and ripe, the kernels bright as jewels, growing on plants that had received no fertilizer, no pesticides, no irrigation beyond her own 2 hands and a bucket. David didn't say much that evening, but as they walked back to the house in the purple twilight, he took his mother's hand and held it in a way he hadn't since he was a small boy. And Margaret knew that he understood, not the science of it, not yet, but the truth of it. The truth that some knowledge is older than universities, older than laboratories, older than the entire agricultural industrial complex that had tried to convince her she was doing it wrong. The university came in late August, not because Margaret had called them. She didn't know any professors. She was a widow with a high school education and a farm that had been losing money for 20 years. But someone had noticed. Someone had driven by her field, seen the impossible green in a sea of brown, and taken a photograph. That photograph had been shared, then shared again. Then it had found its way to the Agricultural Extension Office, and from there to the desk of Dr. Samuel Okonkwo, a professor of sustainable agriculture at Oklahoma State University, who had spent his career studying precisely the kind of system Margaret had planted. Dr. Okonkwo drove to her farm on a Tuesday morning, bringing 2 graduate students and a trunk full of equipment. He was a tall man, Nigerian by birth, with a voice so gentle it made you lean in to hear him. He introduced himself at her door, explaining who he was, showing her his credentials, apologizing for arriving unannounced. Margaret invited him in for coffee, the way she had been raised to do with any visitor, and they sat at her kitchen table while the graduate students fidgeted in the living room, trying not to stare at the old photographs on the walls. Dr. Okonkwo asked about her field, not in the condescending way that experts often ask laypeople about their work, but with a genuine curiosity that reminded Margaret of her own father. She told him about her grandmother, about the circles, about the seeds in the mason jar, about the 3 sisters, corn and beans and squash, growing together the way they had grown for thousands of years. She told him about the drought, about the lack of irrigation, about the fact that she had used no chemicals at all, and she told him about the results, the harvest that was almost ready, the ears of corn that weighed heavy in her hands, the beans that had produced more than her pole bean rows ever had, the squash that would keep her through the winter. Dr. Okonkwo listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down his coffee cup and asked if he could see the field. Margaret led them out, the 3 academics following her across the dry grass like disciples following a prophet. When they reached the south field, Dr. Okonkwo stopped at the edge and simply stood there. For a long moment his head tilted slightly, his eyes moving across the circles in a pattern that Margaret recognized. He was seeing the spiral, he was seeing the system. And when he finally stepped into the field, moving between the mounds with a care that bordered on reverence, she knew that he understood what he was looking at in a way that her neighbors never had. The graduate students went to work immediately, pulling out measuring tapes and soil corers and cameras, documenting everything with the urgency of people who have stumbled upon something they didn't expect. Dr. Okonkwo knelt beside one of the mounds, his dark hands in the dark soil, and he began to explain. He told Margaret that what she had created was called a polyculture system, a method of farming that had been used by indigenous peoples across the Americas for millennia. He told her that the 3 sisters, corn and beans and squash, were one of the most efficient and sustainable agricultural systems ever developed, a system that modern science was only now beginning to fully understand. The corn provided a structure for the beans to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, feeding the corn. The squash shaded the ground, suppressing weeds and retaining moisture. Together they created a microclimate that was more productive, more resilient, and more ecologically balanced than any monoculture could ever be. He told her that university researchers had been studying these systems for years, trying to replicate their success in controlled experiments. But there was something about her field, something about the specific combination of old varieties, traditional mound preparation, and the spiral pattern that seemed to exceed even the best results from their research plots. He asked if she would allow them to conduct a formal study. He asked if they could take soil samples, plant samples, yield measurements. He asked if she would be willing to share her methods with the scientific community, to teach others what she had somehow preserved from a tradition that most people had forgotten. Margaret looked at him, at the excitement in his eyes, at the respect in his voice, and she thought about Harold Crenshaw. She thought about the neighbors who had laughed. She thought about the grain elevator man who had offered to plow her field under. She thought about David, who had worried, and about her grandmother, who had pressed a seed into her palm and spoken words in a language that had almost died. And she said yes, not because she wanted to be famous, not because she wanted to prove anyone wrong, but because her grandmother had given her something precious, a piece of knowledge that had survived centuries of erasure, and it was her responsibility to pass it on before it was lost forever. The study began immediately. The graduate students came every week, measuring and sampling and photographing. Dr. Okonkwo brought colleagues from other departments, soil scientists and entomologists and plant geneticists, each one arriving with their own equipment and their own questions. They set up weather stations at the edge of the field. They installed moisture sensors in the mounds. They tagged individual plants and tracked their growth with a precision that would have made Margaret's head spin if she had tried to understand it. But she didn't try to understand it. She just kept farming. She kept walking her circles. She kept harvesting the beans as they matured, and the squash as they yellowed, and the corn as the husks dried to the color of parchment. The harvest itself took place in late September, on a day so perfect it felt like a gift. The sky was a deep, impossible blue, the air cool and smelling of earth and dry grass. Margaret had invited David and his family to help, and they had come, bringing neighbors who had somehow transformed from mockers to helpers over the course of the season. Even Harold Crenshaw showed up, his side-by-side parked at the edge of the field, his arms crossed in a posture that was no longer hostile but simply awkward, as if he didn't know how to be around a woman he had underestimated so completely. They harvested by hand. There was no other way. The circles were too irregular for machinery, the plants too intertwined to be separated by anything but human fingers. Margaret showed them how to do it, how to twist the corn from the stalk without damaging the plant, how to pull the beans without disturbing the squash, how to cut the squash from the vine with a knife that had belonged to her grandmother. The children ran between the mounds, laughing, their arms full of produce. The adults worked in a silence that was broken only by the sound of corn hitting the bottom of buckets and the occasional murmur of discovery as someone pulled back a husk to reveal colors they had never seen. By the end of the day, they had filled the bed of David's truck 3 times. The yield was beyond anything Margaret had expected. She had planted 5 acres of her worst land with no chemicals, no irrigation, and no modern equipment, and she had produced more food than she had ever grown on her best 20 acres using the conventional methods. The corn was heavier, the beans were more numerous, the squash were larger and sweeter, and the soil, when Dr. Okonkwo tested it after the harvest, was richer than it had been before she planted, the nitrogen levels higher, the organic matter increased, the microbiome more diverse. She had not just grown food, she had healed the land. The university published their findings in the spring of the following year. The paper, co-authored by Dr. Okonkwo and his graduate students, with Margaret Holloway listed as a contributing researcher, caused a small sensation in the agricultural science community. It documented what they called the Holloway polyculture system, a specific arrangement of traditional mound planting, heirloom varieties, and spiral patterning that had produced yields comparable to industrial agriculture while using no synthetic inputs, no irrigation, and no fossil fuel-powered machinery. The paper included photographs of Margaret's field, the circles green and thriving against the brown background of the drought-stricken county. It included data on soil moisture retention, nitrogen fixation, weed suppression, and biodiversity. And it included a section on what Dr. Okonkwo called Indigenous agricultural knowledge, the kind of wisdom that was passed down through generations and that could not be replicated in a laboratory. Margaret didn't read the paper. She didn't need to. She was too busy planning next year's field, expanding the circles to 10 acres, saving seeds from her best plants, teaching David's children how to shape a mound and press a kernel into the soil. But she did attend the conference where Dr. Okonkwo presented the findings, a small academic gathering in Stillwater where she sat in the back of the room in her Sunday dress and listened to professors discuss her farm with words she barely understood. When Dr. Okonkwo introduced her at the end of the presentation, the audience stood and applauded, and Margaret felt her face grow hot with embarrassment. She hadn't done it for applause, she had done it for her grandmother. She had done it for the seed in her palm. She had done it because it was the right way to plant corn, and she had known it was the right way, even when everyone told her it was wrong. The story spread beyond the academic journals. A local newspaper wrote a feature, then a regional one. Farmers began calling, asking for advice, asking for seeds, asking if they could come see the field for themselves. Margaret answered every call. She welcomed every visitor. She walked them through her circles and showed them what she had shown Dr. Okonkwo, the system that worked because it was designed to work, because it had been refined over thousands of years by people who understood that farming is not about conquering nature but about participating in it. Harold Crenshaw came back in the second year. He didn't drive by slowly and smirk. He parked his truck and walked to her door and asked if she would teach him. He had lost most of his crop to the drought the previous year, and the bank was getting nervous. He needed a new way, and he was finally ready to admit that maybe the old way was it. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't mention his mockery, though she remembered every word. She simply handed him a hoe and led him to the field, and they spent the afternoon shaping mounds together, two old farmers learning how to farm all over again. By the third year, there were 10 farms in the county using the Holloway method. By the fifth year, there were 50. The Agricultural Extension Office, which had once pushed hybrid seeds and chemical regimens, began distributing information on polyculture planting. The university expanded their research, sending graduate students to study not just Margaret's field but the fields of her neighbors, documenting how the system adapted to different soils, different climates, different conditions. And Margaret, who had never wanted to be a teacher, found herself at the center of a movement she had never intended to start. She is still farming today, her back more bent than ever, her hands more calloused. The circles have expanded to 20 acres, and she has a small crew of young people who come to learn, to work, to carry on the tradition she almost let die. David left his insurance job and moved back to the farm with his family, turning their harvest into a small but thriving operation that sells heirloom produce to restaurants and farmers markets across the state. And every spring, on the first warm days of April, Margaret walks her field with her grandchildren, pressing seeds into their palms the way her grandmother pressed a seed into hers, whispering words they don't yet understand in a language that is slowly, finally, being remembered. Margaret Holloway planted corn the wrong way. She planted it in circles, the way her grandmother had taught her, the way people had planted it for thousands of years before anyone knew what a university was. And 4 months later, the university came to her, not to correct her, not to fix her, but to learn from her, to study her field, to understand what she had never stopped knowing, that the old ways are not broken, that the old ways are not primitive, that the old ways are simply the ways that work, the ways that have always worked, the ways that will keep working long after the experts have moved on to their next theory and their next failure. She planted circles in a world of straight lines, and the circles grew.